The drive for women's rights in the United States began very early on, and there's a famous passage from a letter that Abigail Adams wrote to her husband John Adams, delegate at the the Second Continental Congress, future president of the United States, March 31, 1776. She writes in this letter, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. That is to say, you've declared yourself in favor of independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors have been. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. So you notice that Abigail Adams is claiming for her own sex, for women, the same values of the American Revolution up to this point. No taxation without representation, no imposition of laws upon us without our own opportunity to present our views and to consent to these laws. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. And one of the great things about Abigail Adams and John Adams is it's very clearly established they were best friends to one another. So she's hitting John Adams where he lives at this point. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity, with impunity? So that is what Abigail Adams says. The business about I desire you would remember the ladies is a famous phrase. Well, here's what John Adams thought of all that. This is a letter that Adams wrote to James Sullivan the same year. The same reasoning which will induce you to admit all men to vote, all men who have no property to vote, with those who have property, will prove that you ought to admit women and children. For generally speaking, women and children have as good judgments and as independent minds as those men who are wholly destitute of property. Depend upon it, sir, it is dangerous to open so fruitful a source of controversy and altercation as would be opened by attempting to alter the qualifications of voters. There would be no end of it. New claims will arise. Women will demand the vote. So look at this. Look at this passage. If you admit men to vote, if you give men the right to vote who don't have property, well, the argument is if they don't have property, they don't have the judgment necessary to vote. Well, in fact, there are women and children um, who have the ability to think about issues and so forth. I don't know about children, but women. But the reason why children is in there, is to denigrate women. They're put in the same kind of category. So you can just see how absurd, even to the founders, the idea of women having the right to vote, seemed to them, and for that matter, other kinds of rights as well. Let's talk about a couple of phrases: patriarchy and what's been called male privilege. Now, what John Adams and the founders lived in was a social system that we have come to call patriarchy. This is a social system in which men hold primary power and dominate roles in political leadership, moral authority, social privilege, and the control of property. Now, is this natural? Well, there are some who would argue that that it was natural, and you'll find these people around today. But it isn't actually natural. If it were, then all societies would embrace patriarchy, but some societies are structured so that power is shared between men and women. This was true of many indigenous nations, or if you want to say indigenous communities or tribes or what have you. This is what we're talking about. it's not transhistorical. It hasn't always existed. And Gerda Lerner, whom you saw the video about, she did a book called The Creation of Patriarchy, and she did a great deal of research back into the past, the distant past, and she argued that patriarchy in the ancient Mesopotamia region arose gradually between 3100 BCE, that's BC, BCE stands for before Common Era. BC is before Christ, and if you want to sort of remove religion from the naming process, you go with BCE, before Common Era, and then so emerges between 3100 BCE and 600 BCE. She argues that there was a sex-based division of labor in the Neolithic area, that is to say, the new Stone Age. This made sense. It was adaptive, but it wasn't meant to become a power structure. And yet it did. It gradually became a system of sexual oppression in the Bronze Era, which is the first era that emerges after the new Stone Age. The Neolithic era gives way to the Bronze era. So, thus for patriarchy. Now you've got male privilege, a system of unearned advantages for men. And you've probably heard of white privilege as something that's been thrown around. We're all supposed to clutch our pearls when that gets mentioned. Well, this goes back actually to the idea of male privilege. It's a variation on that. And I think it's a lot easier to understand the idea of male privilege than perhaps it is to understand the idea of white privilege at first glance. Men were considered to be, for a long, long time, the natural holders of formal power. For example, in European monarchies, the lines of succession were based on lines of succession that were based on daughters rather than sons were considered to be tenuous. That's why England's King Henry VIII famously went through 6 wives in a vain attempt to have a healthy son as his heir. Only men could own property, except under exceptional circumstances. Any property that a woman held before marriage became the legal property of her husband when she was married. Women could not vote in the United States until the passage of the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920. Access to higher education, political office, and careers was limited to men, except when men permitted women to have a career. Women were commonly teachers. Horace Mann preferred teachers to men. Horace Mann preferred women to men as teachers. They were commonly teachers until they became pregnant, when they were expected to resign to avoid being fired. This practice was common until the 1960s and remained legal in the United States until 1979. My mother taught for 1 year. She taught home economics at a small high school in a small town in eastern North Carolina. She became pregnant with me early in January of 1959. She was allowed to finish out the school year, but the rule was, when you became visibly pregnant, that's the time when you were supposed to resign. In her case, she was able to get through the rest of the school year, and then she turned in her resignation. Back in those days, women teachers didn't really think anything of it. They didn't resent it or anything like that. It was just like, this is what you do. This is the way the world works. People tend to take the world as they find it. It would be kind of an exercise in frustration to think about all the ways in which life is unfair. And so we tend to find ways in our own minds to think of life as being fair. Of course, the role for women is to be homemakers, professional homemakers, as my mom took it. And so, of course, when they become pregnant, it's time for them to move on from the profession of teaching and on into the role of mother and professional homemaker. To go on to the next thing, married men were considered to be the heads of households by law and by custom well into the 20th century. And the proper role for wives was considered to be that of a homemaker, unless poverty required that they find jobs outside the home. So the idea of being, um, you know, a what we now call stay-at-home mother or professional homemaker, as my mom would put it, that was considered, a status symbol. And the idea of having to work a job was considered to be evidence that you didn't have enough money in your family, or if it was a nice job, evidence that you didn't care anything about your kids. And that was problematic too. So the idea of women having a career as something legitimate is something relatively new on the American scene. To keep going, husbands had to co-sign applications for credit cards and loans for their wives until 1974. Women could be hired and fired at will and denied benefits available to men until the 1975 U.S. Supreme Court decision in what's called Weinberger and Weisner ruled that discrimination on the basis of sex was unconstitutional. So this is 11 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ruled that discrimination on the basis of race was unconstitutional. Women had no legal protection against sexual harassment until the 1980s, when first the concept of sexual harassment came into being and was codified, and then um, the legal scaffolding for laws against sexual harassment, punishing men for sexual harassment, came onto the scene, not without a considerable amount of controversy, I might add. Husbands could force their wives to have sex. The legality of marital rape was, well, you couldn't have marital rape. It was legal. And it was based on the legal premise that a woman, by marrying, gave irrevocable consent to have sexual intercourse with her husband. The legality of marital rape began to be challenged in the 1970s and 1980s, but until 1993, only in 1993 did marital rape become illegal in every state. Now, the last point I want to make here is that it's from the concept of male privilege that we get the concept of white privilege. And white privilege is one of those things that's just like, it was privilege. The idea of privilege is something that within academia was well understood. We sort of put it out into the wild, and it gets conflated with the ordinary way in which we think about privilege. And so, if you're white and you come from a working class background and you're the first member of your generation to go to college, I didn't come from a privileged existence. Why am I being accused of coming from a privileged life? I wasn't born with a silver spoon in my mouth. Well, the concept of male privilege became the basis for the concept of white privilege when a white feminist scholar named Peggy McIntosh applied the idea of unearned advantages of men to the unearned advantages that she herself possessed as a white person. And she first published on this subject in 1989. It was considered kind of groundbreaking at the time. And by the way, she was so she made this list of about 40, 50 things in which she had an unfair advantage over men and women of color. And she was so used to all of these unearned advantages that she had to carry the list around in her pocketbook for a long period of time before she could memorize them. And she eventually wrote an essay, which we're going to read down the line, called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. In other words, you're carrying around this knapsack of unearned advantages, and you're not even aware that it's there. If you don't like the idea of white privilege, another way to look at it is that minorities, people of other races and ethnicities, are subjected to unearned and undeserved disadvantages in our society. So you can get away from the idea of privilege if that makes you uncomfortable. We'll talk more about that in a future lecture. Let's get on to the Seneca Falls Convention, July 19th, 1920th, July 19th and 20th, 1848. You've seen the video about this. Just to recapitulate, it was held in Seneca Falls, New York, first convention in the United States to advocate for, I'm quoting here, the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women, end quote. And you'll notice that there are men and women who are there. Prominent attendees included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who organized the event, Lucretia Mott, a well-known orator. She was a Quaker, one of the few denominations that regarded women as equals, and also Frederick Douglass was there. The women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement were closely intertwined. And Stanton, during the discussions and deliberations at this convention, surprised most attendees by demanding that the right to vote be included in the declaration of sentiments that resulted from the convention. And the document is in this module, and I will expect you to become familiar with it. Douglass gave his strong endorsement to this right to vote idea because, not only was it just in its own right, but also he was thinking in terms of, well, if you give women the right to vote, then you're going to give African American men surely the right to vote. So it was a matter of establishing a precedent that would be useful to free African Americans. Indeed, it should be useful to really to all Americans. Elizabeth Cady Stanton also wrote this declaration of sentiments, which was signed by 100 of the 300 attendees. So, there's 200 of them did not sign off on this. Okay. To wrap things up for this week's lecture, antebellum reform movements were an important and broadly successful effort to respond to the political, social, and economic turbulence generated by the market revolution, as well as the emergence of democracy in the United States. The Second Great Awakening was used to temper the behavior of raucous young laborers. Public education emerged to meet the needs for a market economy in which literacy was more important than it had been before, and the values desired by businesses could be instilled. It also helped to assimilate Irish and German immigrants, in particular during this time, into American society and into American customs and into American manners and ways of doing things and thinking about things. The temperance movement attempted to control the social disruptions, including domestic violence caused by the excessive consumption of alcohol. The discovery of the asylum was influenced by the desire to impose order on a turbulent society. And then in a lecture that we already saw, the emergence of democracy spurred the women's rights movement. Getting ahead of myself here. So we just saw that. And then finally, the anti-slavery movement, which we discussed at the beginning of all of these lecture presentations. The anti-slavery movement was a result of the expansion of slavery and a belief in making real the revolutionary ideal of equality and religious revival. So all these things go into the anti-slavery movement. One final thing I will say too, and we'll see this more next in a future lecture presentation, but there was a sense early in the history of the United States, United States of America, during that period, that slavery was a necessary evil that was gradually going to go away. The Cotton Revolution changed that. It meant that slavery was going to be around potentially forever. And you also began to see the emergence in the South of a new understanding of enslavement as not a necessary evil, but as a positive good. How can it be a positive good? It seems pretty strange to us. Well, we'll see why white Southerners could think it was in a future lecture presentation.